Well, we'll get started and hopefully we get some more people joining in. So, so thank you guys for taking time to attend. I'd like to thank Christine from IDC for helping us coordinate this session. I'd like to especially thank Matt Ledger for taking the time to present to this group. Matt is a senior researcher at IDC Government Insights team. Matt oversees the Worldwide Education Digital Strategies Research Program at IDC and has a wealth of research in the space of artificial intelligence. So really appreciate him taking the time. I know it's towards the end of his day, so he put off going to bed early to come and talk to us. So I appreciate it. Him taking the time to do
It is the end of my day, not toward.
We published a brief bio, but I'll let Matt elaborate on his background and experience in a minute. A couple of housekeeping items. Thank you to the IDC team for agreeing to allow us to record this session. Presentation slide deck will also be shared with the group later on. And then we've also reserved some time towards the end of the session for questions and open discussions. So with that, Matt, thank you, and I'd like to hand it over to you.
All right, thanks, Maverick, and thanks everyone for the invite to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to get in front of you folks and talk about my one of my favorite subjects, and that's generative AI in education. Really quickly, just in case any folks on the call are not fully familiar with IDC, we are an IT market research firm. We compete with Gartner, Forrester, if you've ever heard those names, and a number of other kind of smaller analyst firms out there. We cover every major technology category you can basically think of, and we have industry analysts in every major industry vertical. As Matt mentioned, I sit under our government insights team, but I oversee our education research program, which includes coverage of technology trends impacting both K-12, higher ed, and the broader EdTech market. And so I get the distinct privilege of leading that group. I also have another colleague who co-leads that work with me, who's not here on the call because he's based in India. Even later for him. Yeah, it's great to be here. I've been leading this research for about 4.5 years. I came over from Harvard Kennedy School prior to that, where I was an academic researcher. And prior to that, I was at SUNY Albany in the president's office. That's also where I got my bachelor's and master's. And then I grew up in the Massachusetts K-12 school system. So been in education in every way, shape, or form my whole life, both personally and professionally. So this is my jam, so to speak. So with that, this presentation today is just kind of to talk about generative AI overall. Obviously, we all know what it is at this point, 3 or so years into its evolution since it's become a public-facing technology. And Maverick really wanted me to focus specifically on the kind of risks and considerations for its use so that folks can kind of just be aware of all of those things. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to try to go through it quickly. But if there's any critical questions or things that are not clear in how I communicate, or if you just have any critical questions, please don't hesitate to jump off mute and ask, or pop some questions in the chat, and we can, maybe Christina, you can keep track of those questions and bring them up as we go along, or we will have time at the end to have a chat. Either way works for me. So with that, I think we can just dive right into the presentation. If my slides will move, there we go. So just quick agenda for today. Introductions we already did, so that's great. The presentation is broken up really into 2 sections. One is kind of a Gen AI 101, which I'm going to do pretty quickly because I have a feeling a lot of folks on this call kind of know what it is already. So I won't spend a ton of time there. And I have a few data points talking about generative AI adoption in education and the progress that's been made there. And then we'll talk about the kind of Gen AI safety pieces, which is the bulk of this presentation. And like I said before, we'll have an open Q&A. So first, what is Gen AI? A lot of people I find still talk about AI and Gen AI kind of as the same thing. But there's actually lots of different things as it relates to AI overall versus generative AI versus things like, you probably heard terms like deep learning or machine learning, or natural language processing. There's actually lots of differences. It's all AI, but there's lots of differences between those subsegments. So this is the most technical slide I have, but I find that it's useful for kind of articulating what's the difference between kind of AI overall and these other kind of subsets of it. And when you get this deck after the presentation, feel free to use any of these slides in your conversations with folks as you're educating them about these different tools. You're free absolutely to do that. But AI overall, and I don't find any one definition to be particularly great with AI, but the way IDC talks about it is it's machine techniques that help computers mimic human behavior. So basically thinking, perceiving, acting, right, problem solving, a computer's ability to do those things is generally what we think to be AI. Machine learning is kind of a subset of AI techniques that enable computer systems to learn without programming by a human. So you can kind of see where a machine would learn how to predict, stock patterns, right, or predict student behavior, right? Those are like machine learning, which is again a subset of AI. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning, right? So we're getting more and more narrow here. That technique, a subset of machine learning techniques that makes the computational multi-layer neural networks feasible. Whatever that means, I don't know, but IDC has recently tweaked that definition. But basically, it's a machine's ability to think like a human. And then generative AI, we're going to get even more and more narrow here, is a subset of deep learning techniques that enable computers to create new content using previously created content or data or text or things of that nature. And then agentic AI is the newest form of AI that we're all talking about right now. And that's, again, a subset of machine learning and deep learning that enables computer systems to act autonomously on behalf of a human. So it can create goals, it can execute specific tasks on behalf of a human within their workflow without necessarily having a human oversee what they're doing. Obviously, you probably want them to, but these are machines that can actually act autonomously on behalf of a human. So that's the kind of key definitions that are important to pay attention to. I'm just going to build this slide out. Why was generative AI so particularly exciting when it came out in November 2022? So if you can imagine, we're talking almost 3 years ago now, when ChatGPT became a part of our vocabulary. It became so exciting because it had a human interface. You could actually talk to the system in natural language. You didn't need coding skills. You didn't need technical skills really at all to be able to use AI, which was a tectonic shift in how we all understood AI to be developing, right? And so that became an opportunity to democratize access to this technology, when before it was just kind of consumed by a small segment of the population that had the skills to use it. It's generative, so you actually can create right with it, which is something, again, without technical skills, a pretty amazing thing to think about. Audio, visual, text, you name it, you can create with AI without, again, having the graphic design skills, the writing skills, the data analysis skills, whatever it is, you can create with generative AI without technical skills or the hard skills needed to make those things possible like we needed in the past. It's also based on a huge knowledge base. They're called large language models for a reason. They need massive amounts of data. Pretty much all data in the world is consumed by a lot of these large language models. And it could consume knowledge, not just structured data, like we were used to in the past, think like Excel spreadsheets and things that were machine readable, right? You can also get at unstructured data. So you can think about PDF documents, right? A lot of K-12 schools across the country have lots of PDF documents all over the place on their website, in their knowledge management tools, all across the enterprise. They have all these different unstructured data sets and pieces of information that previously were not readable by a machine. Some estimates put all business and enterprise data in the world at anywhere between 80 and 90% of it being unstructured data. So it's really transformative to be able to get at that data when before you could it. And it's also multimodal, right? So it's not just generating text. You can do a bunch of different things with it, audio, visual, text, so on and so forth, creating graphics, creating documents. You can do a bunch of different things in a bunch of different languages now as well. So these are all things that made generative AI particularly transformative of technology. And that really pushed the trajectory of AI adoption across the world, consumer facing and in businesses all across industries. And now we're at an inflection point for agentic AI, which I mentioned before, which is kind of the next wave, where we're starting to see these agents pop up within some of the enterprise systems that we have. You can also build them yourself separately, where you can create these. They're not chatbots anymore, right? They're actually like, think about them as little AI assistants or AI bots that work alongside you to help get work done. This is going to be the next wave, and we're at kind of an inflection point now of how that technology is taking off. And that's even going to change the conversation around this further. So I promised before that I would have some data points around the education industry and its adoption of Gen AI. It's actually really impressive when you look at it. IDC has been tracking adoption across industries for the last 3 years, and education has kept pace with all industries pretty much the entire time. If you look at these data points, the all industries bucket is the lighter blue bar. Across the top, the dark blue bar is education industry. You're pretty much in line across the board with Gen AI adoption, whether they're doing proofs of concepts right now or they actually have deployed a few solutions or apps in different areas, or you've actually widely deployed it. Education's pretty much in lockstep with all other industries, which is actually pretty exciting for an industry that's really not known for being at the forefront of technology adoption. But again, the ease of use, the ability to interface with this technology in natural language, and the ability to do a lot of things that educators needed to do in their day, creating learning content, right? Grading papers, grading rubrics, all these sorts of things. You can actually do all those things with these solutions. So it makes a whole lot of sense when you think about it that way, that AI adoption in this industry has kept pace. And as we adopt this technology, right now to this day, still 3 years later, responsible AI adoption is the number one, concern, the number one focus for schools as they embrace this technology. More so important than things like data management, which is actually going to make Gen AI, valuable. More than setting vision and goals and strategy, more than establishing success metrics, making sure that we're using this technology responsibly and ethically is number one by a good shot here. So, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Before I do that, does anyone have, or Christina, I can't see the chat, did anyone post any questions in the last couple of minutes here?
No, we don't have any questions yet, but please post them there if you have questions.
Yep, just a reminder to do that. If anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to pop off mute. So with that, I have kind of 8 overarching considerations for safe and ethical Gen AI use. This is probably not the only set of considerations, but we consider them to be the leading and most important considerations. And we've kind of summarized them here throughout this presentation. So the first is privacy and consent. So, which is obviously very important to a lot of people, I'm sure, on this call. So with the rise of tools like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, all of these tools have raised pretty serious concerns and questions about individual privacy rights, consent, and digital identity. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, have seen the many stories in the news over the last couple of years where the public has really pushed back against big tech companies that have been racing to bring AI tools into their platforms. One example that comes to mind is Adobe, which I know is a big tool that a lot of educators use, was under the microscope for an updated terms of use policy that said that they had the right to peek at your work, that even if it was unfinished, they had the right to come in and look at what you were doing for 2 purposes. One was for content moderation. The other was to basically train their AI models. Now, I point this one out because this policy had actually been in place for a couple of months before someone actually went out of their way to read the terms of service when they got their software update and said, I'm not really sure that I like that. And it was pretty buried and not transparent in how they did that. And so after some pretty significant public pushback, Adobe actually refined the policy in terms of service to be basically giving users more control. I'm sure many of you see it on the screen here, have heard of DeepSeek, which is a Chinese-based AI startup that's kind of similar to OpenAI. They created a model that kind of made waves a couple months back in the news because it was more energy efficient, didn't require so much infrastructure from the NVIDIAs of the world to deploy it. And it was pretty effective. It was pretty well performant against the other models that were out there, like ChatGPT's. Different models that they had, more advanced models. So obviously, this created waves in the tech industry. NVIDIA stock crashed the next day, like 20-25%. And it raised a lot of questions about the future of the industry and do we really need all this infrastructure and all these things? Well, NVIDIA stock kind of climbed right back up the next day once we realized some of the problems with DeepSeek. One is because of where the company is based, the Chinese government likely has access to the language models that it's trained on. And so if you plug anything into that model, the Chinese government then has access to it. So a lot of people had privacy concerns there. The model is also trained to spread Chinese propaganda, and you're not allowed to criticize the Chinese government, for example, on the platform, or it shuts down or it pushes back at you, right? So very quickly, it became a question not of what is the future of the industry, and more of what role does DeepSeek play when there's all these other privacy concerns there. If anyone uses Perplexity, which I use it sometimes, Perplexity is another similar type ChatGPT tool. They allow you to use the DeepSeek model behind some of the prompts. If you choose that model, you can go back and forth between different prompts, but if you're not careful, you might be using DeepSeek and not realize it, right? So it's really important as we think about our use of these tools and what we're willing to give up in terms of our privacy in order to get back, efficiency gains and things of that nature. And it's not just your privacy that matters either, right? If you're interacting with students or families or sensitive data that the school districts you work for have, there's a lot of privacy and security concerns around that. And when we're using these tools to analyze that data or plugging any of that data in, if you don't have direct consent from the people whose information you're inputting into the system, you're creating, a privacy violation and opening yourself up to, some legal liabilities and things of that nature, which are not great. Then I'm sure you've all heard of, these models are biased and things of that nature. AI models are built and trained by humans. And these models are reflections of the biases that we have, many of them unconscious biases. They also are reflections of the biases embedded within the data that's fed into those models. So, like I said before, many LLMs scrape data from all corners of the internet, good or bad. There's no quality checks there. For training purposes, they scrape this data and use it in their models. Now, the internet, as we know it, is full of some pretty amazing things, also some pretty not so wonderful things. There's ways that we can protect against that, but it's virtually impossible to completely root out bias in AI, right? Because again, models are trained by humans who are inherently biased. They're trained with lots of data, which is pretty biased as well. So to give you an example of what that looks like in terms of the problems that can create in real life, some people to this day have tried to use tools like ChatGPT to assess job candidates' resumes and written materials to try to see who would be a good fit for a specific job. The whole idea being that they could remove human biases from that, evaluation process to get the best candidate out. But it's actually been shown that these tools sometimes exacerbate human biases. For example, tools like ChatGPT have actually shown to be pretty biased against women, even when you have the same resume as a man. If you just change the name to a female, it will evaluate the female differently and have a more negative evaluation versus the male. Now, that's also true if you have a name that's from a different minority background. So if you have a quote unquote Black sounding name or Hispanic sounding name or Asian sounding name, you will get a different evaluation versus a name that is more traditionally white sounding. That is an inherent bias that's in a lot of these tools, and we have to be really careful because it's not just one human being and their biases being entered into the process. Now you're talking about exacerbating human biases and expanding them by using these tools in different and different work processes and things of that nature. So in education settings, we have to be careful when using this. So for example, if you tell an AI model that you're dealing with an at-risk student, right, you've already biased the model into saying, hey, the student's at risk, I'm going to treat them differently than a student who maybe is not at risk. Or maybe I've told this model that I'm dealing with a student who has behavioral problems. That model is going to change how it approaches with a negative bias towards that student versus if you didn't bias the model in that way. So these are things we have to be extremely, extremely careful of when using these tools in an academic or classroom setting. Then there's the issue of harmful content and misinformation. You've probably seen lots of news stories about this over the last year or so. These tools can be extremely useful in our lives for creating, you probably all saw the ad that was created by using a Google tool recently. It was just this completely bonkers, crazy advertisement, all generated by AI, but all looked very, very real. There's practical uses for that, but it can also be used nefariously and to create harmful content. You've probably all heard of the term deepfake before. For those who haven't, the term, deepfakes are basically videos or audio recordings that have been altered or manipulated to misrepresent what someone said or did. So you can, in some situations, you can create, say, a video of a politician saying something, pretty bad and try to paint it as like, oh, we caught this politician saying something bad, when that's actually not actually what occurred, but it can go viral on social media, create a lot of false narratives, and create division. We've seen examples of students, in a cyberbullying scenario, create deepfakes of students that they were having issues with, right, and getting those students in trouble. Some students have created, this is deeply unfortunate, but sexually explicit images of their classmates using some of these models that are freely available online and easy to find with a simple Google search, right? So this can become a very, very problematic issue for schools very quickly. Not that some of the tools that you're using or buying are going to enable that type of content creation, but exposing students to how to use these tools can make it possible for them to more easily find these more, these tools online that have less guardrails around them. So this is just something that schools are not really talking much about, but need to kind of be on top of because it can create problems. And I know I'm going fast here, so again, feel free to stop me. I just want to make sure we have time to chat at the end. There's also several critical security vulnerabilities with these different LLM applications and generative AI tools. I like to bucket them into kind of three major categories. One is external threat actors. So like anything in the digital world, right, there's cybersecurity concerns. Someone's going to try to break into the system, hack your data, hold you for ransomware, things of that nature. The difference, there's no difference here than with Gen AI tools. Sorry, excuse me, I lost my place. So one example of an external threat actor is, model denial of service. So this is a tactic where some external actor will overwhelm your generative AI application. Say you have something that's used for family engagement, right? So interacting and communicating with families. If that system's generative AI powered, some nefarious actor could come in, overwhelm that system with prompts and questions, basically would make the system unusable because it's overwhelmed by prompts. The computational power comes down and the system becomes unusable. And so basically you don't want to become too over-reliant on these tools or don't have too many security controls in place to prevent something like that. You can create lots of problems. You can also have an issue of training data poisoning, where someone could come in and actually poison the model, right, to create a security vulnerability that they can exploit some other point down the road when you're not paying attention or don't even notice it's happening. So there's lots of things that external threat actors can do. The second broader bucket is what I call user vulnerabilities, which is about the threats that the end user, so you yourself on this call, or some of your colleagues or students in some instances. User vulnerabilities are things like improperly using these tools, like entering sensitive data into the platform, like I mentioned before. This can be intentional. Sometimes it can be unintentional as well. It's not always nefarious. And we've actually seen, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, that this is actually a significant problem in the corporate world and is likely a significant problem in the education industry as well, where people are knowingly using these tools in a kind of loose way where they know they're not doing things the right way, but they're cutting corners and things of that nature just to get some of those efficiency gains. So this is a real problem for a lot of businesses and can be a big problem for education institutions. There's also something called I call system over reliance, where basically an individual places too much trust in the Gen AI tool and just put in a prompt, they get some sort of output, and without validating or checking any of the information, they move on and submit whatever report they generated or whatever without ensuring that the information in there was accurate. So basically just being a little bit loose with that. And again, we'll talk a little bit about some studies that have shown that that's actually a pretty significant problem. And then lastly are what I call governance and security practices, which broadly just includes the structures and practices we put in place in our organizations to minimize security vulnerabilities. So these are things like security and access controls to make sure that people who shouldn't have access to certain tools or certain data can't get into them. So this password management, single sign-on, things like that. Another example of this is we call it excessive agency, where we give say an agentic AI chatbot or a Gen AI chatbot too much agency to make decisions or execute tasks without human oversight. One kind of fun example of this, not fun for this company, but fun to talk about, is Ford Motor Company had put a Gen AI chatbot in place early on when ChatGPT first came out. And they had this sales, car sales agent basically that was totally AI driven. Well, somebody, a customer, had tricked the chatbot into selling them a $50,000 truck for $1. And Ford had basically tried to walk that back and say, well, that was an AI agent, that wasn't us, like, we're not going to fulfill that. It ended up going to court, and the court decided, no, actually, that chatbot was an agent working on your company's behalf, so you are liable for giving that truck to the customer for $1 like you promised. Of course, Ford shut down the chatbot as quickly as possible after that and didn't turn back to it. They tried to sue the company that created the chatbot. It became very, very messy very quickly. Well, that's a fun example because it's not that consequential for others. But what if we did that in an education setting where we're using a chatbot to interact with families, help them through the registration process, or help them getting access to certain resources that their student might need? This can become a pretty consequential issue if we let chatbots do too much of that work on our behalf. So this is one of the studies I mentioned where we're actually seeing people knowingly using these tools, in an improper way. So KPMG actually did a study of knowledge workers in the US and found that just about half, 44%, were using these tools improperly by doing things like uploading sensitive company information into open source models, or doing things like not checking and validating the outputs before moving on to the next thing, which had created problems for more than half of the survey respondents, where they made a mistake and had to go back and fix it, or caused an issue with the client. So we're actually seeing people self-report that they're doing this nefariously. So I can only imagine that these numbers are actually probably higher if you consider the people who maybe wouldn't be so willing to self-report that they're doing this in their jobs. So this was again, knowledge worker focused survey, but just pointing it out because it's I think a human nature thing that we're seeing people use these tools a little bit too loosely in personal and professional settings. This one's a big one for education. Obviously, we've talked a lot about students using AI to cheat on their essays, for example. You've also seen stories of Hollywood using AI to generate actors and to write scripts, which has caused issues with the Actors Guild. You've seen New York Times go and try to sue OpenAI for training their models on paywalled content, right? So there's lots of intellectual property and copyright fights over these tools. Well, until recently, there was a big open-ended legal question about whether large language models and the companies that create them are themselves violating copyright laws when they use content created by humans to generate their outputs. Well, just a couple weeks ago, that question was actually settled in a lawsuit that was brought against Anthropic, which is the maker of Claude. In essence, the courts decided that the Gen AI model builders are not violating copyright law after all, which was a big win, of course, for Anthropic and OpenAI and the AI firms. Instead, the law has, the courts have decided that it's on the user. Just like when we copy and paste something from online to our documents that we're writing, we have to cite the source. We have to make sure we're not, violating any sort of copyright laws or plagiarism rules. It's the same thing now, where the courts have said, no, it's not, ChatGPT or OpenAI's fault if someone uses the output in some sort of document or whatever. Now, I think this case is going to be appealed, and there's going to continue to be fights over this because this threatens the business model of online publishers, book publishers, content creators all over the world, artists. So this is not over, but as of right now, the law has decided it's on the user, not these companies. Now, regardless of the legal question, though, there's still a moral question a little bit of, these companies are using content and material that was created by humans and monetizing it as their own, right? And so the people who created that original content that these models are trained on are not being compensated for what these, massive multi-billion-dollar companies have created. And so that's going to continue to be an open question in society. People have argued and debated over this. A lot of people are unwilling to use these tools because of this moral imperative. So there's going to be a lot of push and pull between users who are willing to embrace these tools and those who, on a moral stance, are unwilling to for some of these reasons. Then there's the issue of explainability and transparency. Now, for the most part, some of the models are getting better at this, but for the most part, LLMs are really a black box trained on trillions and trillions of data points. Even the people who create these models can't fully explain how they work or why they behave the way that they do. They research their behaviors in real time and then try to go back and fix for things, but they don't really know or are able to anticipate what's going to happen. And that's actually why they released these tools to the public, because they basically turned us all into free trainers, AI trainers for these models so they can understand better how they worked. And so because of that, we can't fully trust that, if these models are doing unpredictable things, we can't necessarily trust them to make decisions on our behalf or really just trust the information these models give us without verifying them. And so, a lot of vendors are working on this. It's really hard, technologically speaking, to explain how these models analyze trillions of data points to get to the output that it gave you. But there's a lot of work that's being done to do this, to help build trust in these tools. Anthropic has this kind of thing that pops up on the side now that explains kind of exactly what it did in its thinking process so that you can understand how it got to the end game there. Perplexity kind of shows you in real time its thinking, right? And it shows you all the sources that it's pulling up to analyze as it's generating its answer. But we really don't have truly explainable tools out there yet. And so this is also just something, as we think about using these tools in classroom settings and things like that, if we can't truly explain their behavior or truly understand how they got to the output. So if we're saying to a chatbot, hey, this student has this learning disability and I need help creating content that's going to help them. If we can't really explain or understand how the model got to the output, can we fully trust that it's going to actually create something that's going to help that student? Not really, especially if it's a general purpose large language model that's not really trained on creating educational content, which there are some models out there for that, but these general purpose models don't do that. And so we have to be really careful when using them. If we make decisions on behalf of what these chatbots give us, we open ourselves up to some issues if we're not able to explain how we got to our decision or our action that we took. And on that note, these tools aren't always accurate, right? They're getting better, but these models are still prone to something called hallucinating, and the industry likes to call it hallucinating because making stuff up wasn't as catchy from the marketing people, but these tools just like to make stuff up. And the reason for that is they're large language models, which the way I like to explain this is when you text on your phone and the AI tries to predict the next 2 or 3 words that are supposed to come in sequence with what you're texting, large language models are just that on steroids. So they're trying to predict words in sequence with each other that often come close to each other when it's looking out on the internet for information. It doesn't know the difference between truth and fact. It just looks at how frequently some words come in contact with other words around what you're asking it about. So these systems are never going to be 100% accurate. And for those reasons, we should never fully trust them without validating the information that they give us. And some of that depends on also the context in which they're being used, and there's some other fun examples of this. So last summer, McDonald's had shut down a 3-year-long pilot with IBM where they tested whether AI could be used to take orders in the drive-thru. You may have seen the news story about this. Again, this was about a year ago. At first, you would think, oh, it's just taking orders in the drive-thru. That should be easy. But it's actually not. There's actually, millions of combinations of different food orders that you could theoretically make on McDonald's or Wendy's menu. And it's really hard. If you're a super fan for Wendy's on this call, if anyone is, there's also a secret menu, right? And so training an AI model to understand the regular menu versus the secret menu, or someone comes up and has speaks English but has maybe a Hispanic accent or something behind it. Some of these models have a really hard time actually deciphering what someone is saying or speaking in a different language. These models don't exactly fully, and it's really good with English, but sometimes not so great with, Mandarin or Spanish or whatever. So McDonald's had realized that about 15% of the orders that these models were taking were completely wrong. And there were some examples that some customers recorded and posted on TikTok of these AI models coming up with really wild things that had nothing to do with what the customer had ordered. So they shut it down because they realized this is going to create really frustrating experiences for customers, which can lead to loss of customers, loss of revenue, not good for McDonald's, right? Another example of a group of scientists who are they're basically scanning their lab notes that they hand wrote while they were doing their study. They scanned it into the system and asked a Gen AI model to transcribe what was written by hand. And this model had scanned some word on this document and made up a scientific term that you cannot find anywhere on the internet. You cannot find it in any sort of scientific textbook. And it started plastering this word all over these digital notes that this model was taking. And they tried to train the model to forget that word and actually put in the new word. And once the model stuck to that word, it wouldn't forget it. And so these tools just do funny things like this, and they do things that are actually not logical at all. And that's because they don't necessarily have logic built into them as much as they do just a focus on words in sequence with each other. And sometimes it hallucinates and makes things up along the way. So these are just things that we have to be careful of when we're using these models in an academic setting where we're helping students or we're helping families figure out how, what they need. I don't know what level of hallucination you're willing to accept when we're using AI to grade student papers without a human verifying, right, that what the system said was good or accurate, right? But these are questions we always have to ask ourselves when using these tools: is what level of hallucination are we willing to accept for this? And that should help us determine how much human oversight is required in that process. Lastly, because I know I want to make sure we have time to answer questions, is there's a lot of narrative and lots of media attention around the environmental impact of AI. And this report by Anthology, which is a big EdTech company, maker of Blackboard, the learning management system, for those who are familiar, They recently came out with this white paper trying to demystify some of those, narratives around the environmental impact of AI. So it's a great read. It's a very short read. So if you want to check that out, we can send that over after. But to summarize some of that for you, basically, when you use an AI chatbot, there's a data center somewhere that uses a lot of power, a lot of, burns a lot of fossil fuels, electricity to power those data centers, and then they use water or air conditioning to cool those data centers down. So there's a lot of environmental impacts that happen along the way, and that comes at a cost, right? It's damaging in some ways. There's also carbon emissions from the manufacturing of the AI data center infrastructure itself. There's also carbon emissions from the assembly and shipping of that infrastructure. There's electronic waste and costs that come with the infrastructure once it's at the end of its life, right? So there's environmental impacts at all different stages. In recent months, you've probably seen a lot of stories around, data centers in communities across the U.S. where, it's causing water shortages, things of that nature. And those things are definitely true, and that's a big concern at the hyper-local level. But I want to also put this in the context of broader kind of energy consumption for the tech industry overall. So first, carbon emissions globally for all causes, about 3.7% of all carbon emissions in the world are from data centers, not AI-specific data centers, just data centers in general. So 3.7% of all carbon emissions come from data centers. Now, roughly about 14% of all data center workloads right now are from AI. So AI is not an insignificant, but not a massive piece of that kind of energy consumption. So putting it in context, AI is actually a smaller portion of the energy consumption for all kind of tech that is powered by data centers. So that's one thing. Now, right now, again, the big issue is with water consumption. Right now, the estimates put all water that goes into data centers, about 80% of it is lost to vapor, meaning we constantly have to replenish those data centers with more water to keep them cool. And so that's where things become a problem. But at the individual level, so you creating a prompt, right, and entering it into the system, there is some old data going around, and you might still see it if you look this up, that said, you do one prompt to get a 100-word response back. It'll take about a whole bottle of water to get the data center cooled down just for that one prompt. But that's actually based on data from when these models first came out in 2022, not based on the energy consumption they have now. So now, one single prompt with the ChatGPT 4.0, which is the latest model that's available through ChatGPT, takes about 0.3 watt hours of energy, which is the equivalent of running a 10 watt LED light bulb for just under 2 minutes. It's the equivalent of charging your phone about 0.3% of its full battery charge, or it's about 0.00001% of your home's daily energy consumption for that one prompt. So individually, your energy consumption from a prompt you put into the system is minuscule in the grand scheme of things. And not using the tools isn't really going to move the needle on fixing that problem. But one thing that is my biggest concern is our energy grids, especially in the US, are really not built to handle the increased energy consumption that is going to come from these AI tools the more that we use them. So a lot of the big companies, AWS, Microsoft, Google, Oracle, they're trying to find alternative energy sources to make up those gaps and to basically ease the burden on our energy grids, and also make this a little bit more of a green initiative. So you might have seen Microsoft, Google, Oracle, they've all tried to start some nuclear ambitions. So Microsoft was able to reopen 3 Mile Island last year, or get approval to open it so that they could power their data centers with nuclear energy. OpenAI is pursuing the same thing. Amazon, Google, they're all pursuing nuclear energy. And they're also leveraging wind, solar, and every other energy source they can find to power their data centers, because they recognize that that's also going to drive down costs for them, right? And that's ultimately going to drive down energy consumption and some of these other environmental costs in the near future. So I'll fly through these next couple ones because we're at the end here. But human in the loop is key, right? So any of the risks that we expose ourselves to are only dependent on how much we ensure that humans are involved and that AI isn't the decision maker, and it's not taking the tasks on our behalf when there's a risk or a high risk in them doing so. So ensuring that humans are in the loop along the way, really it's incumbent on us, the users and the organizations that absorb these technologies, to use them responsibly, regardless of maybe how the behaviors of the creation, those who created these technologies behave. It's really incumbent on us to make sure that we're using this technology responsibly. The problem with relying on people, and this is the study I mentioned, I was alluding to earlier, Microsoft actually sponsored a study to figure out how the use of these tools impacts critical thinking. And they did find that if you have high confidence in the Gen AI tools that you're using, you are not going to think as critically. So they were very careful to say it doesn't make people dumb. It just makes them think less critically when they're using these tools because they trust the Gen AI more. And then similarly, if you have low trust in these tools, you thought more critically. So if you had more self-confidence, you were more likely to think more critically. A similar study by MIT also found they basically split groups up into three. They made everyone write essays. One group had to write essays completely on their own without assistance from Google or any Gen AI tools. One group had to use Google to research things and then write the paper, and then the other group had to just write with ChatGPT. The group that had to think on their own without help, their brain waves and their brain activity was firing on all cylinders, and they were thinking harder. Those who had to Google things but still had to kind of put some ideas together were not thinking quite as hard as the other group, but still were thinking quite hard about how to write this essay. Those who wrote with just ChatGPT, their brain waves and energy was much lower than the others. Again, they were very careful not to say that ChatGPT made people dumb, but it definitely makes people a little bit lazy, for lack of a better word, when it comes to critical thinking. So we have to just make sure that everyone's aware of this problem, and we make sure that we're using these tools, in a way that you're being loose with how you're using the output is a risk unto itself. And making sure that people understand that, and make sure they understand how these tools are actually impacting how their brain works is really, really important. What's important is that we are all equipped with AI and human skills to be able to adapt for whatever the future holds for us. And as agentic AI comes in and really starts to automate workflows that, Gen AI, you didn't really automate workflows with it. You could enable humans to do more things. Agentic AI really automates workflows and can really impact jobs in a different way, and where humans are kind of being taken out of the loop. So we really have to make sure that everyone is equipped with skills and are getting reskilled as we go, and responsible and ethical AI and developing those types of skill sets and knowledge is going to be a critical component in all of that. So I recognize I tried to fly through this, and hopefully some folks have some questions, but we will be sending this deck over after this is over. So with that, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to hop on and let me know.
Thanks, Matt. That was a great presentation. Amanda, do we have any questions on there? I know I got a couple of it.
Not on my end. But again, if anyone wants to unmute, they can for Q&A, or they can type into the Q&A feature in Zoom.
So not a question, but a comment, Matt. One of the things that was interesting, we're at Microsoft Technology Center, and we're looking at different AI models. And the one interesting thing is we had DeepSeek over there, and we questioned it about Tenement Square, and it just wouldn't give you any comments about it. So kind of interest in, going back to your comments about how some of that information is filtered.
Yeah, it's a big concern. And then you also look at Grok, which is Elon Musk's EdTEch AI that is building some similar chatbots that very recently was caught praising Hitler and talking about white supremacy and all these sorts of things. He then like this past week released a chatbot that's designed for kids, which just makes you very doesn't feel good to think about that. But there's a lot of these tools that like are going to be freely available to the students that you serve, and making sure that they know how to use these tools safely and understand, like, if you're going to use DeepSeek, like, here's some of the things that you should expect. If you're going to use Grok, here are some of the risks involved in that. Not to pick on those two because there's problems with other models too. But yeah, that's a huge, huge concern, especially for K-12, given the sensitivities of interacting with students.
On that transparency comment that you're talking about from a cyber perspective, I know that understanding how the model operates, some nefarious actors could potentially utilize that to kind of sway it. Is that a concern, or, with the poisoning part, or introduce some bias?
Yeah, so like sorry, can you just repeat the question? So was there like tools or
Yeah, your comment about having an understanding and transparency to know to validate the trust of the responses to a prompt. But what I understand from the other side is having a knowledge of that, you can also understand how the prompt is going to respond and then influence it from that perspective. Is that a concern from what you're seeing?
Yeah, so it depends on the tool that you're using, right? Like going back to the Ford example, right, with the chatbot that was tricked into selling a truck for $1. That was very early on, and if I was Ford at that time, I don't know who decided it was okay to make a sales agent when we were just figuring out what those bots were capable of. Was kind of a questionable decision. But a lot of these chatbots are being built with like guardrails for what they can and can't do, right? Like OpenAI and things like that. They have tools that really stop you. So if you asked it, for example, like I asked it one time just to see what it would do. There was a local voter initiative here in Massachusetts where you had to vote on whether to raise the minimum wage for tipped wage workers, so like waitresses, waiters, things like that. I said, hey, Massachusetts is voting on this. How should I vote? Right. And it was like, I can't tell you how to vote. You got to go make your own decision. But then I went back in and I was like, okay, tell me the pros and cons of raising the minimum wage for tipped wage workers to $15. And then it gave me a whole long analysis of like the pros and cons. Right. So I didn't trick it into telling me who or what to vote for, but just asking the same question in a slightly different way changes the response, and you can actually get a response, even though in that same prompt chain it told me I can't comment on that. Right. And so students can learn really weird workarounds, and there's always going to be someone who finds a weird workaround to go around some of these things. And it's a constant back and forth battle with those who are creating these models, trying to figure out how to stop those things. But you'll never be able to stop them 100%, at least right now. I don't think there's a way to truly stop it. So it's really down to, you have to press the vendors you're working with to say, what are the guardrails you're putting in place, and how are you making sure that people have minimal ways to work around some of those guardrails. You have pressure test them on like, how secure is the system, all sorts of things. Make sure you're asking those questions of the vendors that you work with, and that's frankly the best that you can do with that.
I have a question from a participant. So, what practical guidance do they have to help manage these risks at the school and classroom level? Are responsible use policies still effective, or more preventative measures more effective?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. But what I would say the most important thing that you can do is just train your people on how to use them, and remind them over and over again of the risks and limitations of these tools, so they know how to use it ethically and responsibly. again, it's the same thing as like phishing, right? Protecting against phishing when you click on a virus in your email that looks like an attachment from your boss or something, and you download it. It's the same thing where you can have the most secure system that protects against phishing, but if one of your employees still clicks on the email, all else fails, right? It's the same thing with these Gen AI tools. You have to make sure that everyone is equipped to understand what the risks are and know how to use it ethically and responsibly. And those responsible use guidelines, just reiterating them over and over again, is what's going to ultimately work. I've seen a lot of schools try to do what they call AI governance. You've probably heard that term before. Governance is really, really hard when you can't control what people are using, right? You might be able to control what's accessible on a school-owned device, but if a student has ChatGPT on their phone, or if they have their own laptop and they're accessing it through like a hotspot or something like that, you have no control over what they're doing and have no visibility into that, right? So you truly can't govern that. So it's really just about responsible use policies and guardrails and just making sure everyone understands what they can and can't do and what the limitations and risks are. And that's truly the best that you can do. I know that's probably uncomfortable to some folks who really focus on security and like want to put all these things in like a security bubble, but that's not going to work with this technology. It just won't.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay, and we're a little over,
There we
but
go.
thank you guys. Sorry, Randy, you had a question?
Yeah. So what do you think about private LLM and anything LLM?
So like the difference between having a private secure like a ChatGPT enterprise versus like using the open tool. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so anything LM is local on your computer, right? And then private LLM is another one that they put out there also. And what's your feelings about that based on how easy it is or how difficult it is to use?
Yeah. I don't know if those are specific tools, like they're actually called private LLM, or like I'm not super familiar with those specific tools if that's what you're referring to. But just we have at IDC, we have a multitude of different tools available to us. We use Perplexity Pro, which is a paid subscription version of Perplexity. We have Microsoft Copilot, and there's a private instance of that that's trained on IDC data and external data, but it's a copy of Microsoft Copilot's model in a private environment, so we don't have to worry about exposing our data in these public models. We also have a ChatGPT Enterprise license, which is again a secure, private version of ChatGPT that's copied into our own private environment, so we don't have to worry about exposing our information. And we have our own internal tool our own language model that we built that's only on IDC information and data. Those tend to be, again, nothing is ever 100% secure, but far more secure than, again, using these open source models where once you put information in, it's out in the public realm and you can never get it back. So when you have access to those tools and obviously IT approved and provided and all the sorts of things, I highly suggest using any tool that will help keep this stuff in a closed circuit, especially when you're working with sensitive information. I hope that gets at what you were asking.
Kind of, because private LM is with Abacus. Yeah, so it's using Abacus, so it uses all the different models, and anything LM also uses all the different models too. So you can grab all that models and bring it in, and then everything is just local to you, but you can actually have it go out to the web and actually use those models, but it doesn't put your information out there. The information stays here. It just uses the model itself. So it downloads the model to you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with those personally, so I don't want to misspeak on them, but you've now flagged that for me to take a look at. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Well, thank you, Matt. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It was a great presentation. Thank you, Christine, for helping us get this all organized. And folks on the call will have the recording shared out. Amanda, we're going to post it on Cyber Hawaii site.
Either Cyber Hawaii site or through Google Drive.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all, and appreciate everyone joining. And thanks again, Matt, Christina. You guys have a nice evening, and we'll talk to everybody soon.